Okay, so I was bothered yesterday by the fact that the space between these two trunnions wasn't matching up with the space between the two cam shafts here. They were just a little bit off. They needed to come a little bit closer together because otherwise these actuating arms, these linkages, wouldn't have been quite parallel, you know, that one would have been off a little bit, right? And I'm thinking they need to act like a parallelogram. They need to stay parallel to each other as the brake moves, as it's actuated. So I went online, I think where most everybody goes nowadays. I went online and searched around for articles on this, and I did find a really nice write-up. And the guy explained that this is exactly what needs to happen, that these need to stay parallel so that they apply equal force on each one of these camshafts. And even when you're adjusting them, and there was a really good procedure for, I've actually found a couple of good procedures for adjusting these. And the manual by Pete Snidel in BC is really good. I bought that years ago and I never regretted buying that. Pete's just a whiz at this. I'm also on the Enfield Bullet group online that fella in India runs, Guru Nandan, and it's also a really good source of information. There's some really good folks there who've done a lot of work with these bikes. Tim Busby in New Zealand is just an excellent source of information. But anyway, there was a good procedure for adjusting these guys. I did find a couple of mentions in an article about, because both these trunnions are threaded, so that when you spin the rod one way, they're pushed further apart, and then when you spin it the opposite direction, they're pulled closer together. So that's what I'm going to end up doing. I'll loosen out the lock nuts and move them. But there was one article that recommended, and I think it was the one on the short arm here, drilling this out. So you would drill out the threads that are inside this trunnion so that it just can move up and down freely, and you use the lock nut to push it up and down. And this guy was advocating this, but the fellow who wrote the first article I mentioned actually mentioned that and recommended against it and said that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. Whoever wrote that didn't understand how these work, because that person's aim was to be able to adjust one at a time. But I mean, really, you shouldn't need to. I mean, once these things are put in place like this, you can see you've got the shoes in. They already start off parallel. You know, like these things, just by nature of the spring squeezing the two shoes together up here at the top, they already start out parallel. So the shafts are in the right position. They're already in the right position. Putting these on here with the splines, like and the mating splines and the arms, if I moved it like this, that's what would put it out of whack. But as I mentioned yesterday, they've got these little indentations, little dots that line up. You line up those dots, you end up with the correct position for these guys. And then it's just a matter of moving moving this linkage rod between the trunnions to draw them closer together or further apart, and adjust the shoes out that way independently of each other. So I'm going to give it a try. I'm definitely not going to modify it by drilling this out. I think I'll be able to get this, but it was a pretty good procedure. It talked about putting it back on the bike and basically squeezing the handle. So I'll just get a clamp and I'll just keep pressure on the cable on the handle. And then while the shoes are pushed out against the drum, that should center this plate around the axle, and then you tighten the nut on this to hold it in the correct position on the axle so that it doesn't move. Now, one thing that was interesting was when I was reading these articles, I came across mention of this nut backing off if these weren't adjusted evenly. If they were adjusted unevenly, what will happen is, what the article was saying was, one shoe will push out as the bike is moving more than the other, and it'll actually tend to shift this plate a little bit. And it doesn't have to shift it much, but you know, every time you brake, it shifts it a little bit. And the effect is, one of the effects that it mentions is, it'll start to back off this nut. And it's been doing this since I bought the bike, and I'm thinking, you know what, that may have been the reason this nut was always backing off. I thought it was just because there's no lock washer underneath, there's no Loctite on the threads, but it did say this, because this is cupped. This is the nut that goes in here is not a flat nut. It's flat on one side, the side that's out, but the side that's in is actually got a bevel on it, and it's cupped, and it fits in there nice and snug, so that it doesn't allow this to move around too much on the axle when it's around there. So I thought maybe that's why. And the reason I thought maybe that's why this was always backing off, because these were out of adjustment, is because it also mentioned a second problem, which I also have, which was a cracked mudguard stay. So because it does this, it doesn't apply even forces on the brake drum, on the wheel. What ends up happening is the two forks that come down, they offset a little bit, just a little bit, enough that you can actually crack a mudguard, which happened to me. One of the mudguards on the right-hand side of the bike cracked, and I couldn't figure out why it cracked. I thought, oh, just a bad mudguard. But now, and that was years ago, now I'm not so sure. It may very well have been because these guys were out of adjustment, and just the forces involved in moving along and trying to brake the motorcycle have actually shifted the forks, shifted this a little bit, so it may have all been playing together. So it's pretty interesting. So anyway, so that's my next thing to do here now. I'm going to back off these lock nuts, and I'm going to adjust the position of them. They should come out a little bit more. All right, let's give that a try.